the topic that I chose for today is loneliness. And I feel obviously loneliness is it's a very relevant topic kind of in general, but obviously during COVID times, it's a little more aggravated. And so I felt it's kind of more relevant to talk even more now. So what I want to cover is, basics about, how do you define loneliness? Why do we feel it and why does it hurt so much? And, just like the fact that we are not alone in it and what can we go and do about it to feel less lonely. And some of this is very commonsensical, but to be honest, I have gone through my own in my life a lot of loneliness. And when you're going through it, none of this common sense really strikes, right? So I feel like it's good to, especially when you're not going through it, and if you're going through it, to actually just articulate and talk about it explicitly to help you lay out the fundamentals a little bit more. So anyway, so it's very hard to really define what is loneliness. And I looked online, for like dictionary definitions and what have you. But the one that I kind of figured that resonated with me was loneliness is the unpleasant feeling, right? It's an unpleasant feeling that we feel due to lack of social connection in our lives. So it's an unpleasant feeling that we feel due to lack of social connections in our life. But then the question is, what is a social connection, or how do you define connection? And I like this definition by Dr. Brené Brown, which says connection is that energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued. Right? So it's energy that between people when you feel seen, heard, valued, and when they give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from a relationship. But if you have to oversimplify it, connection is that feeling and the energy when people feel seen, heard, and valued. And when you don't have this connection, that's that unpleasant feeling of loneliness. Now, who feels loneliness? Pretty much everyone, right? The ex-Surgeon General of America, Dr. Vivek Murthy, recently released a book, highly recommend, Alone Together. It's on loneliness. And he says, more than 20% of adult population in America struggle with loneliness. That's more people in this country than people who have diabetes or people who smoke. So just like, let that sink in on how prevalent this problem is. Right? More people feel lonely than people who smoke or have diabetes. 20%, so 1 in 5. Right? In 2018, UK became the first country in the world to appoint a ministerial lead for loneliness, right, for the country. And they published an official loneliness reduction strategy as a country. And then a lot of other countries are also kind of following suit, and like more and more countries, at a national level are recognizing this as a problem. And obviously not to mention COVID has aggravated it, right? So loneliness, people say, is it's the quiet pandemic, right? I mean, COVID is obviously the pandemic we are going through now, but loneliness has been and continues to be the quiet pandemic in the world that we live in today. So one thing before we move on, I want to differentiate on what loneliness is not. So a difference between loneliness versus being alone, right? So loneliness is different than isolation or solitude or being alone, right? All of these to me is the same thing. Isolated, solitude, being alone is different than loneliness. Because solitude or isolation or being alone is an objective thing, meaning, you are not physically surrounded by people and not connected to them, so you're actually in isolation or solitude. So it's a very binary thing. Either you're isolated or you're not. But just because you're alone or isolated does not mean you're lonely. I mean, one can say if you're isolated and alone, it might lead to loneliness, but it may be correlated, but it's not causational, right? Also, you can feel lonely even when you're surrounded by people, even when you're in marriages and intimate relationships, right? Loneliness is a very subjective experience of each person. And I would argue actually a big part of removing loneliness is to learn the art of solitude. Right? Once you learn how you can be alone it leads to you feeling less lonely. So just a differentiation between the word loneliness and alone. So let's talk about, why do we feel it? Right? I mean, I've said this over and over, probably in every talk of mine. We are wired. We are wired for connection. We are social beings. Humans are social beings, right? So originally, like thousands and thousands of years ago, right, living in tribes meant we will not die, right, by being eaten by a tiger or of hunger. So biologically, we got wired in our brains to live in groups, and seek social connection and not be living alone, for example. Now let's take it even further, right? So just then live more than living in physically living in communities, it also there is an emotional need of it, right? uh, to be heard, to be seen, to be understood is a basic human emotional need. And when this is not met, we feel lonely. Right? We feel lonely not only in our struggles, we feel lonely in our joys too. Right? I just got the best job in my life, but I have nobody to call and celebrate with. I can feel lonely, right? Or of course, I'm going through a lot of struggles in my life. I can feel lonely in that too. So, what happens is when we feel lonely, it actually in our body is perceived as a stress signal. And a stress hormone like cortisol is actually released in our blood. And that stress motivates us to go do something about it, right? To seek connection, which is a good thing, because when you feel acute loneliness, it forces you to do something. And when we feel connected, right, we have hormones like oxytocin that is released in our body, like also called as love hormone sometimes. So all of this to say our brains are actually wired for connection and not for being like lonely. Now, why is loneliness an issue? So let's say you're feeling lonely, I'm feeling lonely, there's unpleasant feeling. So what's the big deal, right? The problem, the issue from loneliness, besides it being just unpleasant feeling, right? Of course, like it doesn't feel good in that moment. There are a lot of other consequences of being lonely, like physical consequences. So one of the studies found that lacking any social connection may be comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes per day as a risk factor for mortality. I mean, just 15 cigarettes per day, and how it increases your mortality rate, it's the same that loneliness can do. Another study found that loneliness increases the risk of earlier death by 26%. Again, Dr. Vivek Murthy, he said that leads to chronic stress and inflammation in your body and higher chances of cardiovascular diseases, right? So heart attack or what have you, cholesterol. Loneliness is not just physical health, right? So these are just physical health. So you don't want to die obviously soon, and you want to live a healthier life. Also emotional health, right? Loneliness is one of the major contributors to a lot of mental health issues like depression and suicides. And even if you keep this apart, like, okay, you can say to yourself, well, I'm a normal human being. I don't have heart attack problems. I'm not going to commit suicide. I don't have depression. Then just in the normal spectrum, loneliness leads to us not experiencing meaning and fulfillment and happiness in our lives, right? Just normally. So it causes all sort of issues from mental health, physical health, eventual death, and just not experiencing fulfillment and joy and happiness in our life. So this is why it is actually an issue and something we should address in our lives. Now, loneliness is not a binary state, right? There are different types of loneliness. So it's not like, oh, I'm lonely or I'm not lonely. It's one or the other. You can feel lonely in different areas of your life, to different degrees. Right? So, like, for example, I'm in a very happy relationship, so romantically, I'm not lonely. But I could be lonely in my other places. So just to say, it's not a binary thing, and you can experience it to different degrees in different parts of your life. So in 1973, this Dr. Robert Weiss, published a work classifying loneliness into two types. One is emotional loneliness. The other one is social loneliness. So what he said is, emotional loneliness is what we refer to as loneliness classically, where you don't have intimate connections, to emotionally connect with. So hence emotional loneliness. And it happens when you don't have, very close friends or family members, or of course a romantic partner, right? So that's the emotional loneliness. The other is social loneliness. This is where we don't feel like we belong to a community. It's like it comes from a larger group of communal belonging, right? This could be based on anything, like based on our cultures. For example, as immigrants, you miss connecting with people from your culture, or maybe based on your interests, and you miss being part of people who care for the same issues, or say have same interests. And a simple example is like, I love writing poetry. And I have been feeling lonely lately because I am not part of any community where poets or poetry lovers come together to share or hear poetry. So I've been kind of feeling lonely in that aspect of my life, right? Maybe you are an entrepreneur and you're trying to start a new company, and you feel lonely in your very unique struggles to create and innovate and disrupt, let's say, an industry, right? So loneliness is different. So you can have it from emotional, intimate relationships. You can also have a larger part of community, and one does not suffice for the other. So if you feel one, then you have to use the right strategies to go address them independently. Also to note is loneliness could be temporary and acute, right? Or it could be a long-term and chronic thing. So temporarily based on your life circumstances, right? Let's say you're single living alone, and now with COVID, you're feeling lonely, but just for this like duration of shelter in. Maybe once shelter in is lifted, you feel better. Maybe a very close friend of yours or loved one passed away recently. Then you start feeling that grief and that loneliness, temporarily from that lack of, from that loss in your life. So it could be temporary and acute, but it also could be then long term, irrespective of your, state or condition, you just feel lonely in general. And what has happened, lately, because of, because of the times and the society that we live in, especially, as we have moved, especially in Western societies, right? We have moved from being communal to independent and nuclear. This has aggravated the problem because now we are living more and more alone. Also, not to mention social media, right? We think we are starting to substitute virtual posts and likes with actual, real, meaningful connections. So the times that we are in is actually aggravating the problems of loneliness. As we become more live away from families, lives independently, don't talk to our neighbors, use overuse of social media, etc. So, regardless, however, what kind of loneliness you're feeling, emotional or communal, temporary or long term, the question is, why does it hurt so much? So, the one of the things that I feel that makes loneliness impact worse is that there is shame about it, right? We feel that if we are feeling lonely, then there is something inherently wrong with us. So this feeling of shame that something is wrong with us, and especially if you're feeling lonely because of the lack of intimate connections in your life, we start feeling we are not lovable, right? So, and if you remember from past talks, lovability and achievement are two of the most important things that we care for. So loneliness starts making us feel like we are unlovable just because we don't have intimate connections in our life. And because we start feeling that we are unlovable, we actually stop seeking love and stop seeking connection. So it's like a downward spiral then. And, this also obviously gets aggravated as we age, right? So when you're young, like in teens or early 20s, you are single, everybody around you is single, maybe not in a committed partner relationship. But as you go into 30s or 20s, 30s, or even 40s, everyone around you most often is either in a committed romantic relationship or is married or has a family, right? So then you start feeling the odd one out. And if you are, single, you start feeling like something is inherently hence wrong with you because everybody else was able to find love, right? So we start then thinking everybody else is normal and we are not. So this feeling that we are unlovable and something is inherently wrong with us because we are lonely, and the shame associated with it, makes loneliness even worse. And then the second part of it is, so either you feel like something is wrong with you, or you feel that you're the only one feeling it, right? So you start feeling lonely in feeling lonely, right? So I'm the only one feeling lonely. Everybody else doesn't feel lonely. And that basically, then what happens is then you stop, reaching out and seeking support, because you're like, well, I'm the only one. Then, it's not a normal thing. So anyway, so either you're feeling shame of what something is wrong with you, or you're the only one feeling it. Either of these make it 10 times worse. So all of this to say, like, what is loneliness? We are wired for it. There are different types of loneliness. It's not a binary state. And the shame around it has made it 10 times worse for us to, how it feels, and also to seek support. So then the question becomes, what can we do, right? There are a lot of different strategies we can take. Number one, obviously, is learning to be curious and understanding your circumstances, right? So getting really curious on what is triggering this feeling, right? Is this temporary, or is this like permanent, or like I've been feeling this for a long time? Has this recently started, right? Just having that inner dialogue and curiosity on what happened. And of course, then you go, once you understand that, then you can seek the right support. Other one is, so learning to be curious and understanding your circumstances, right? That's number one. Number two, learning to take care of yourself physically, right? Like, loneliness can start a downward spiral of physical health. And then the lack of good health then starts making you feel more lonely, so like it's just a spiral. So it might feel counterintuitive when you're feeling lonely to, go take care of yourself. But actually, the more you work out, the more you go out in nature, eat healthy, it actually helps with feeling, the emotional side effects of loneliness. So taking care of yourself physically is very important. And also paying attention to, what are our soothing tactics that we are using, like over drinking, over smoking, overeating, watching television, over use of social media. Just being cognizant of what are our soothing tactics, and making sure that, we are not overindulging to then stay in a physical good state. So learning to be curious and understand, learning to take care of yourself physically. These are the obvious ones. The more important ones that we are not taught is learning to love ourselves, right? This is like the most important thing that I feel, if nothing else from this conversation, learning to love yourself will actually change how you feel about loneliness, right? We are all worthy of love, right? I have said this over and over, irrespective of anything, achievement, status, bank balance, education, gender, whatever. We are worthy of love, full stop. There is no prerequisite to it. We are worthy because we exist. And the most important practice of love and connection begins from within, right? Self-love. We have to learn to love ourselves, not in spite of our imperfections, but actually because of them, right? We are all flawed in our own unique ways, but boy, do we deserve love and kindness and understanding from our own selves. So start by telling yourself, I love you, like to yourself. It sounds like kind of weird. Just do it, just try it. Remind yourself that not only you are lovable, but you love yourself even with all the flaws and mistakes and the suffering and the sadness that you're going through. Like, I remember in my life when I was feeling extremely lonely, I would sit on my rooftop in my apartment and I would just hold my hand over my heart and hear my heartbeat. And I would just tell myself, I love myself. This is so important, this practice. So make it a practice. Learn how to love yourself. The other thing is learning to listen and accompany your own self, right? we we talked about it. We all feel lonely at different points in our life to different degrees. So you can just assume that everyone around you has probably felt lonely at some point in their time, so you're not alone in that. And this is huge because it normalizes it, and it takes away that second degree of suffering. So how can you be with yourself and just tell yourself, hey, I hear you and I'm here for you, right? You have your own company no matter what. So one thing I do, as a ritual and a practice is like I hold my hands like this, like it's like holding my own hands, and it's like my own accompaniment. Like I'm being with myself, and I tell myself, I hear you, I'm here for you. So that's to accompany. How can we learn to accompany our own selves? The other one is learn to belong. And this might sound very surprising, but the truth is, we reject love, we reject belonging, even when it comes our way. And I know this personally for me. I have, had chronic loneliness for a long time in my life early on. And even when I was loved and I was surrounded by people, for some reason I would tell myself, I don't belong here. I would reject the love that comes my way because it didn't look, it's not in the shape and the form that, I expected. And I kept looking for signs of the fact that I don't belong here. Our ego, for example, right? We're all special snowflakes, right? Our moms told us. So our ego makes us feel unique and special, right? And so in every circumstance, we start seeing and focusing on differences between us and other people and what makes us unique. And in that feeling of uniqueness, we start feeling that we don't belong here because look, all those people are so different. I'm so different from everybody else around me. I'm so unique, so I don't belong here. But the thing is, the good news is there is so much in common because at the end of the day, we are all human beings, and you and I can assume that we all have the same human needs, and we all have struggles, even if they look different. Like Brené Brown says, if you look for signs that you don't belong, you will find them, right? But stop looking for it. Stop looking for why you don't belong and start looking for why you actually do belong, right? Belonging is our birthright. And so we need to find ways to belong rather than the other way around, right? So learn to belong. Then learn to receive love. I don't know if you guys have read, like there is this wonderful book of Language of Love, right? Where we all have a specific way in which, we express love. And people also say, I love you because of the way you love me. So we all have a very specific need of how we want to be perceived and loved. So if the person who loves us does not love us in the way we want to be loved, we will reject it, right? It's like you speak English, the other person speaks Russian, then you can't talk to each other and you can't understand each other, right? So we all have different languages of love. And if my language is different from my partner's language, then I just say, well, this is not love because the language is just different. So just understanding what is your language of love, how do you want to be loved, and then seeing maybe the other person is showing you love differently, but it is still the same love. The intention is love behind it, right? A simple example, this happens in families, for example, right? Your mom calls you twice a day sometimes. You're like, are you okay? Is COVID hurting you? And you're like, Mom, stop calling me. Like you just reject your mom's love because her way of loving you is concern and worry. But her intention is love behind that call, right? So, but love looks different in this case. So we reject love when it does not come packaged in the package we want. So learning to receive love when it looks different is another very important part of not feeling lonely. And the last obviously is learning to be vulnerable and seeking support and connection, right? Bigger part of loneliness, I mean, I would say the biggest part actually is not being heard and understood, right? So we hold on to our sufferings and our misery uh, because we want somebody to hear us. We want that story of our suffering to be heard and understood before we can let it go. But for you to share that story with someone, you have to be vulnerable to actually share it, right? And that person that you share it with could be anybody, right? You can seek actual support like a counseling or therapy or coaching, or even support circles like out there. Sometimes even strangers actually you can tell your stories to. But regardless, we want to be heard and understood before we are willing to let go of that suffering. So just know that that is a big part. And for you to be willing to share your story, you have to be willing to be vulnerable. So that's a part we have to learn. And obvious things are like going out of your comfort zones and, finding shared community, right? And this is where technology actually can come to a rescue, right? There's like apps like Meetup and, on Facebook or whatever. You can find groups of people who have same interest or same causes that you care for, right? So you can join nonprofits or whatever, but you can find that communal belonging. Because remember, if you're not feeling emotional loneliness, you may be feeling communal or social loneliness. So, knowing what you're feeling and then going and seeking support accordingly. Another one is, again, research has found that companionship of animals can actually help reduce loneliness, right? I know because I have a dog, I love dogs. They really show unconditional love to us, right? They don't understand how much money we have in our banks and what's the skin color we have or how pretty we look. They just love us. So, if you can, I don't know if not everybody can, but if you can, spend time with animals, maybe get a pet. That also will help, you feel less lonely. And especially animals, remind us of playfulness, right? They're very playful. So playfulness and joy in our life. So that's, I mean, and there are many, many other like tactical strategies I will not go into, but these are like, I would say, primary ways of what we can do to deal with loneliness, right? Learning to actually get curious without judgment and understanding our circumstances of why we are feeling lonely. Is it temporary, long term? Is it based on certain very specific triggers lately? Learning to take care of ourselves physically, like our physical bodies. Learning to love ourselves. Like this is the number one takeaway, right? How to love yourself. Learning how to listen and be your own friend and accompany your own self, right? I hear you, I'm here for you. Learning to belong, right? Stop looking for signs that you're unique and different and don't belong. Look for signs that you do belong in communities. Look for commonalities between you and other people. Learning to receive love, right? Letting go of the idea of how we want the love to look and feel, and letting the love that is coming our way come in whatever shape and form it comes, right? Receiving it and knowing we are worthy of receiving it. And of course, learning to be vulnerable, to seek support and guidance and connection, because, we were not meant to live our lives alone, and we don't have to, right? That's the good news. If you want connection, so does everybody else around you. So we are all here for each other. So it's just a matter of us dropping that wall of shame, dropping that wall of, I don't belong here, dropping that wall of I need this love to look in this specific way. I'm not alone in feeling lonely. And then just like reaching out. And all it takes is one person. Brené Brown says this: opposite of loneliness is not togetherness. Opposite of loneliness is intimacy. So if you can just find one person to really open your heart to and have an intimate, quality, meaningful conversation, that's all it takes. So that's all I had prepared for today.